What's up, my martial arts and MMA fanatics? Welcome back to System Breakdowns. As always, I'm Coach Greg. Today we're doing our 35th System Breakdown. I'm very excited to be presenting this. And as many of you know, last month we held a contest so you could vote to choose the next System Breakdown. And by not only popular request, but by write-in, we're doing Khabib Nurmagomedov, who is arguably at least one of, if not the greatest MMA fighter of all time. And you can make a case that even though, yeah, he retired early, we can understand his reasons for doing so. But what makes him so unparalleled and almost above all the other peers when you talk about the GOATs is that he created a wrestling system that works for MMA that is so powerful that we still don't have a blueprint for how to beat it. I'm still kind of waiting and watching and waiting to see who's going to be able to figure out how to do this. And you see this with his protege, Islam Makhachev, who's kind of picking up where he left off, who is now continuing on, and guys are like, I don't know what to do with this, and is kind of running through everybody else. And now that he's the champion, it's going to be really curious to see who's going to be able to figure out that blueprint. And it's tough because the systems that he developed for using the wrestling that he had, that freestyle kind of wrestling that's so powerful that he adapted through Sambo as a champion that he then brought into MMA and evolved throughout the course of his career. And you could see him developing this from fight to fight to fight. And each fight he gets better and more refined and better and more refined. And we're going to talk about where he started and where he ended up and why this system is so effective. So that being said, stay tuned. Let's start breaking down Khabib the Eagle Nurmagomedov. Okay, as always, we're going to start on the feet. Khabib Nurmagomedov, his striking has evolved over the course of his career, and it never became world class, but he definitely tightened it up as it went on. Early in on his career is defined by keeping his head down, throwing big punches that were fairly loopy and wide, designed to back people up. Very similar to like what we talked about with the Conor McGregor breakdown, where he throws these big techniques so that as he throws them, he's not hoping to land, he's hoping to move guys. It's a tactical decision to move guys back towards behind the black line. Khabib does something very similar. He stays on, early in his career, his hands are down a lot. You know, he's always been a big head feinter with that head stuff. And then he drops his head and he throws a big uppercut a lot of times. He likes to lead with that right hand uppercut. Why? Because it creates this response. He wants to move guys back. Here, throws the big left because it's this is actually a nice setup for him. It's wide, but it throws a nice level change and directional change, and it backs guys up. If he lands it, that's great, but that's not his goal. His goal is to set up the wrestling, and he wants to do that by moving them behind the black line. So he drops his head, throws these big techniques, ends with his right foot forward. That allows him to push off and start attacking his single legs. Early on in his career, he does a lot more single legs. We'll talk about that later. But his striking early on was mostly designed around this idea. Keep the head down and just start throwing big loopy punches because you want to move guys back. He does a couple things that I really like. He also throws some other stuff, like he'll throw the flying knees and stuff like that. Bam! He's not trying to knock guys out with it. He's trying to move guys with it. It's a tactical decision to get guys behind the black line and also to kind of give them a moment of pause before they enter too freely. They have to be afraid of big shots. He makes them just afraid of his power, just enough so they can't easily access him. If they do put too much pressure on him, that's going to be fine for his reactive shots we'll talk about later, but he doesn't want them to just feel like they can freely access. So he throws big shots because guys are like, okay, I have to approach cautiously. And that's what he wants, is he wants caution out of them. So by doing so, he has a lot of early success in his career. Later on, he needs to evolve to fight higher level guys, and he does so. But early on, he throws, the big flying knees, he throws occasional, big kicks and stuff like that, but it's mostly defined by head down loopy punches. Later on, he tightens this up. You see this a lot in the LI akin to fight, and that's really where he starts to see that shift in his striking. He becomes a lot tighter here. This hand is always up right by his face to catch things as they come in, and he's going to stay out here, a lot of head feints, jab, 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 right, stay on the outside, jab, throw one shot and get out. He never commits to a lot of big combinations. He throws a one shot to land points and to keep them at bay. It's a very smart tactical decision because the jab allows him to outscore people. He doesn't need to do serious damage with his striking. That's not his goal. Remember, his goal is always the wrestling. So by throwing the jab, one, it's a threat that helps, once again, create caution because he can't just enter freely when somebody is effectively using the jab. And two, it also allows him to score points so that in the striking, if it ever comes down to it, he knows that he's outscoring them because, yeah, he's not landing any real damage, but what he's doing is he's putting hands on a lot. Pop. Right? And because they're afraid of the wrestling, they don't get into these solid exchanges, and it kind of leaves him free to just kind of pick them apart. And that's what happened in the Al Iaquinta fight, where he just pop, pop. Then he's able to freely shoot as he wants. So this is kind of like the definitive change. Now, he does also do one other thing that I want to talk about. I've talked about this on the channel before. There's an in-between moment that some fighters are really good at. And Khabib is one of those guys. And what he would do is he would give guys the impression of like, okay, this is our rest period. We're disengaged, we're going to rest, plan my attack, and figure out how I'm going to enter. This is a common thing in fighting. You disengage, you go, okay, how am I going to enter, right? He uses that moment to go on the offensive. As soon as he sees guys do this, he'll drop his hands a little bit, take a deep breath, create this reaction. Remember, we talked about that monkey see, monkey do principle on the channel, where I do something to try to create the same reaction. He does that. He takes a deep breath, lets them do it, and then he goes on the offensive. This is what happens with Conor McGregor, the famous, right hand that he throws that drops Conor. They had just been in an exchange. He circles out, disengages, his hands are up. He kind of does this like deep breath, and you see Conor like drop his hands and start to think about how he's going to attack. And at that moment, he's on him, and he lands that quick right, and he throws it real quick. Pah! Drops Conor. This is why he gets the reputation for being a much better striker than I think he actually is. He's a good striker, but I think if you put him in like a Muay Thai fight, obviously, you're not going to see him perform as well without the wrestling. But the fear of the wrestling makes his striking effective, and this allows him to be more free with his striking and helps set up his wrestling better. It's really nice when you get guys who do striking and wrestling and a lot of activity in both, like a Colby Covington. It's a very successful system. And for guys who are good wrestlers to start creating a threat, moving guys back, giving guys a moment of pause, and later on in his career, like I said, you get very active with the jab, where you start outscoring and stuff like that. It creates a really nice striking system for him to use. Okay, now let's talk about what you're really here to see, which is his wrestling and his grappling. The thing I want to point out before we get started on individual techniques and breakdowns and stuff like that is the 4 principles that he is most focused on everywhere, whether he's standing, whether he's shooting, whether he's on the ground, everywhere he's at, he is defined by these 4 principles, in my opinion. First is head position. Having his head under their chin, whether he's grappling against the cage or if he's on the ground and he's passing, you will see him really vying for this real estate right here, keeping his head underneath their chin. Very, very important principle. The second one is top position, always. Letting them carry his weight. You see other guys like Stipe Miocic, where we talked about this, the ability to make somebody carry your weight the whole fight by being on top. Whether he's riding on the back of the hips, whether he's on the ground in the half back position, which we're going to talk about later on, making them carry him. If he's, got the leg triangle on the legs, having that head position underneath him, letting them carry his weight so that the burden of effort is always on his opponent. The third one is going to be hip control. It's very important for him in all of his positions to dominate and really tighten up those hips. You see this a lot when he does the back riding a lot. He'll sit on the back a lot and just control these hips with his hips on the outside position, really kind of pinning the hips. So like when he has somebody up against the cage and he does this kind of stuff where he has them backed up here, he wraps around and his hips circle to the outside and he pins their hips into position so that not only is he controlling it with this body clinch that he's doing, but he's also using his hips to keep them from having mobility. You see the same thing on the ground also when you talk about like his passing. One of the reasons he likes the leg triangle so much is between that and his ability to just kind of pin the hips with his elbows and his hands or his head. It makes it very difficult for them to have a lot of hip mobility. So in all of his positions that we're going to talk about, you're going to see this as a common trend of really tightening down those hips. And then the fourth thing is going to be rotation, particularly around this axis of the hips. He likes to rotate around this position. Whether you're talking about him being in here, clinching and stuff like that, going for single legs, threatening to lift up, and then as soon as they start creating some movement, using this to circle and get to this back position and start to circle around the hips. He circles in both directions with freedom, and he does this so that he always maintains his top control. When he's on the ground, you see the same thing. A lot of rotating to that half back position that he really likes, using that, circling to a back as needed, circling to a mount as needed, and just continuing to rotate around. Although his preference is always, once again, like I said, for top position, he likes the half back position. We'll talk about that later. So the 4 key things that you got to look at when we talk about all these techniques is, once again, head position, top position, just being on top of them, hip control, and rotation around the hips. Okay. Early on in his career, he's very defined by a lot of single legs, partially because he comes from a sambo background with a wide open space, gives him a lot of room to work. Later on, he evolves past this because of the cages in the UFC, but he never totally gets away from this, and this is something he goes back to later on. You see this against Al Iaquinta, you see this against Conor McGregor, so later on, he does still use these single legs, but he's got such a well-defined system on it that when he does throw it, man, it's so hard for them to deal with. But you'll see how these principles we talked about come into play. So, for example, there's a couple things he does that he has as an evolved system. So the first thing is, as he comes in here, if they start to sprawl on him, he disengages and he comes up with an uppercut. He's really good at this technique where he comes in, comes up, pop. And he does this when he knows that a guy is very prone to want to sprawl. And he feels them out from the outside, right? He starts to threaten. And if they're ready to sprawl, he goes, okay, he shoots, starts to drop, and as soon as they go to sprawl on him, he pulls backward out, hits him with an uppercut. You see this a lot in his first couple fights. Later on, he'll start to actually go for his single legs. So he's got 4 real techniques that he likes to go for, and they all kind of build off of each other. The first one is, he goes to shoot, he gets a leg, and they start to put pressure on him. I'll show you what it looks like here. He comes here, he gets a little bit of forward pressure where they start to sprawl, but they don't have it yet. So what he does is, once again, we talked about head position. He gets his head under their chin, lifts this leg to push off of, and he drives. This is a cutback. So he comes in here, shoots, they put a little pressure, he gets his head position, lifts the leg, and turns. Gets to a nice top position. Second thing that he does, if they start to stand up on it, he runs the pipe. He shoots, he starts to do the cutback, they stand up, and he runs the pipe. If they start to turn back into it, though, he comes in here, he comes up, and he starts to turn, and he goes to stand up. As they stand up to run the pipe, they start putting a lot of forward pressure. He shoulder shrugs, controls around the hip, and rotates around the hip to get to his back position where he's riding on the hips. So he's hanging out here doing this kind of stuff. The fourth thing that he does is, as he goes to shoot, if he starts coming a little bit shallow and these guys start to pull away and they start getting ready to do this stuff, he goes low single, 2-on-1. Either he drives his shoulder in, or more often he likes to lift it up and start to kind of basically like treetop him. So those are his primary single legs. Once again, defined by the same principles. Shoot, head position, and cut, and change direction. Here, coming up, head position, change direction. Here, they put forward pressure, shrug, hip control, hip rotation, right? Shooting in here, he gets a hold of the foot, and he should have just lifted up on him. So those are his primary single leg attacks. Now, from here we're going to talk about what he starts to get into later on in his career, and really, even early on to middle of his career, he starts to go down this road. And he starts to fine-tune this and get to this. And over, as his career evolves, he gets better and better at this stuff until he refines it down into a system based off of attacking against the cage. And that other guys later on, like Kamaru Usman, picked up off of. So, some of the things he does from here, I want to keep in mind that, remember we talked about hip rotation and hip riding. A lot of times when he does stuff, his goal is to get to this back hip ride position where he can keep them pinned, control the hips up against the cage, and he kind of stays in tight and controls the hips. This is going to give him the opportunity to start doing takedowns from here. He can start doing stuff like, you'll see him control this leg to drop him here, or at least threaten it. He'll do a lot of mat returns where he starts throwing them back. If they're inactive, he's going to kind of like come forward and start getting heavy forward pressure, throwing bombs, and he's just going to kind of control this outside hip position a lot. This is a great place that you'll see him return to both. He's going to seek it both when he's taking them down and as they're getting back up. As guys start to turn away to stand up, you'll see him go to this a lot. As guys start to turn away as he threatens takedowns, he gets to this a lot. So this is like a bridge position you see him use a lot, where he controls the hips and just pins at those hips. Remember, hip control, hip rotation. So when he enters, now, of course, if he gets backed up, he uses his reactive blast double, his reactive singles, But a lot of times his best case situation is to get them behind the black line so that now he can threaten and come in here with a double leg to start to attack and control these hips, head position. Whenever he can, later on in his career, you see this. Early on, you don't really see this, but later on, you start to see him controlling this far side wrist. We talked about this before here. Controlling the far side wrist and wrapping this into what's been dubbed the Dagestani handcuff. I love this. This far side wrist control here becomes a staple in the end part of his career. But he doesn't use it a lot for most of his career. I did want to touch on it though because it's such a landmark thing that now so many guys use with so much success. I wanted to at least touch on it here. But most of his career, he actually doesn't use that, excepting for when he gets guys on the ground and he starts to pull that in. But standing, he doesn't use it a lot. Most of his career, what he does is he comes in for these double legs here. And he's controlling the hips, he's got the head position, and he starts off by threatening something to get to that back position we talked about. He might start by getting an S-grip around the legs, pulling out the legs like so. Common tactic, you go for the double leg, pulling those legs, and you bring them back and you pull them out so that you can get on top. Start to attack the ground game. Common response, from there, guys start to turn away. Oh, he's back to his hip position, that's what he wants. Other attacks he'll go to from here. He'll start to get on a single leg, and he likes to lift the single leg up. Sometimes he does this to go for a Kusotogari. Sometimes he does this just to lift them up and drop them. Sometimes he lifts them up and turns them. Rotation, but he does this by getting their hips off the ground with that single leg as he picks this up here and just lifts with his legs. That's a common tactic of his. Another common tactic is to just start going for the Kusotogari here. As they start turning this way, hooking this leg, going for Kusotogari. Finally, you see, if he doesn't feel like he's having a lot of success here, sometimes he'll start doing some upper body attacks and he starts clinching. He gets his head underneath, gets an underhook, and if he can't get an underhook here, he's gonna start controlling on the top here, and he pinches this elbow in so that his head and his arm can create a tilt. Once he does so, he starts to rotate them like so. Common theme of his is rotating guys off of the cage to get them back. When he does, Kusotogari, he's rotating them to do it. When he's doing his trips and stuff like that, head position, underhook, controlling this, pinning this in here, rotating to throw his trips, to put them back in the center. Lifting the leg and rotating back to center. Pulling them and rotating off of the cage. You pin them to the cage and then you rotate it to throw. And you do this with head position and controlling rotation and hip control. As they defend these initial threats, this is his opportunity to start to get to the back. He lifts the leg, they start to defend, he shoulder shrugs, now he's on the back. He goes to go for Kusotogari, these guys start to defend it by turning back into the cage, he gets the back, right? No matter what they do, they're always in a worse situation. He goes to go for this trip, they start to defend, he shrugs them, gets the back. Constantly returning to his positional dominance, pinning the hips, hip rotation, hip control, and just dominating from this top position. Once he gets him to the ground, and this is whether he does a single leg, he threatens an initial threat and transitions to the back and gets to a mat return or something like that, or his initial threat is successful and he's able to pull out the hips and drop him down. He commonly will get to this top position very early on, but if he doesn't, this is the position he's going to be seeking. Just like we talked about standing, he wants that back position where he can control the hips. From the ground, he likes this half back position. And I don't call it really a back position because it's kind of like a half back, half mount. And sometimes he's in like a quarter mount where this foot, like they start to try to get this foot and stuff like that. He doesn't care. What he's going to be looking for is sitting on top of the back of the hip, head to the back shoulder, and just staying heavy. Riding the hips, pinning the hips into place. So this is the position he's always looking for. And so the nice thing about starting on the back and doing things like mat returns is it's very easy for him to start in this position. A couple principles I want to talk about that he employs from here. Once again, same things we talked about in the takedowns. Head positional dominance, top positional control like we talked about here, hip control and hip rotation. So as this guy starts rolling, he stays here. If he continues to roll, he's here, right? He's never losing his top position because he's rotating around the hips. But the other thing I want to talk about is the constant blending of submission threat through probing, actual striking, and positional advancement. These three things are constantly being used to advance the others. So as he's in here, you know, let's say he's trying to advance up. He's starting in here, throwing bombs to start to climb up. They start to turn away. He might use a Kimura then to start to get to his top position and advance himself up. Then he starts to control in here, goes back to throwing bombs, throwing and choking threats, right? I think one of the reasons he kind of lost his mind a little bit after that Conor McGregor fight is he went for this thinking he was going to be a pro. I think he wanted to beat up on Conor a lot more. And a lot of times what Khabib does is he threatens a submission to create a response so that he can then strike. Threaten and strike. Threaten, positional advance, and strike, right? And I think when he went for that bulldog choke on Conor, I think he thought Conor was going to get out. He threw it as a probe. And when Conor tapped to it, I think he felt a little disappointed. And he had some energy he had to burn off. And he was still angry at Conor. But it's because he uses this probe. And then later on, what happens is, as guys get a little bit numb to this and they feel like they can escape, then he slips it in deep. So he'll do stuff like, he'll come in here, kind of be on the face a little bit, and they slip it off, he throws some bombs. He comes in here, they slip it off, he throws bombs. Then he slips it deep when he really wants it, and he wants to finish that fight. So the probing with it, it's just enough of a threat that they're like, I have to deal with this, right? They're in real danger if they don't. And in Conor's case, clearly he didn't address it well enough, and he was finished with it, that bulldog choke. But the constant threat of it is going to open them up, and as they start to do stuff like peel away this hand, he gets striking. If he gets returned to, like, let's say a guard position or something like that, you're going to see him doing stuff like throwing bombs here, keeping head control, keeping hip control. Then he starts to create real heavy response. He gets his hips high, and guys start to slip in here, and then he gets heavy on top. He threatens a choke, uses that to advance, striking, etc., etc. They roll away, he hip rides. See how all these principles kind of tie together? That's really Khabib's game in a nutshell. So now we're just going to talk about how he does this position to position. I already kind of touched on this, but in the closed guard, what you're going to see a lot out of him, once again, it's defined by head position, tight hips. Sometimes he'll put his head on the side. That's okay too. But a lot of times from the outside, he's throwing bombs, getting his head underneath, raising his hips, throwing shots, or he starts stacking them here. This is something you see a lot more now out of his protege Islam, throwing bombs to create a response where these guys can start trying to put in a knee show just like that, and he can hip and just ride the hips, right, and get to this half back position. As guys start turning away, he uses that to create opportunities for passing by using his heavy pressure, high up, hip control, bombs, stacking, creating a response where guys start putting in a knee shield and stuff like that, and all he has to do is hip ride. From here, he can also do stuff like, as he keeps this heavy pressure and controls the hips, right, basically what he's doing is just tying up the hips so he can't move, coming in here, letting his hips go high, allowing him to do things like knee cut very easily, and just control the hips and the head position. Meanwhile, and as they start to rotate, he just rotates with them and stays on top the whole time. That's really it. If they start to come around this way and start to come on top, no problem. He rides with them, rotates around the hips, stays on top. Now let's talk about one of the positions he's most famously known for. Leg triangling from a mount, head position, throwing bombs. As guys start to turn into him, he triangles the feet. A lot of times it's low, which is interesting because normally, like, you want to get over these knees to start to get by the hips. And so as guys are trying to keep their knees in between them, he just triangles the bottom of the feet, controls the hips, and starts to put his head underneath their chin where now he can throw strikes. This is where you start seeing him reaching behind and getting this far side wrist. Guys start posting here to try to deal with this. He grabs it, feeds it, and now, look, he's back to his half back position. This is why he uses it. He goes to the half back, guys start to sit up into him, they back up to the cage, no problem. He uses their response against him. Triangles the legs, head position under here, feeds the wrist, breaks him down. Once again, getting to this position that he really wants, which is the half back position. The reason that this is so important is his two most dominant positions, if you notice, are based on common responses. What are the two most common ways that people get off the ground? They're on the bottom, they go to their knees, and they start to stand up, right? Well, you can't do that with Khabib because he's going to control your hips and he's going to back return you. The other way is for guys to back up to the cage and start to sit up, right? Guys like Connor do this a lot. What happens if you do that? He triangles your legs, head position, throws bombs, feeds the wrist, gets to the half back, and now he's back where he wanted to be. I have two final points on this I just want to mention real quick. One is Khabib's ability to fight off of his back really made it difficult for people to want to take him down, because when the first thing that happens is when you take somebody down and you end up in a triangle trap, and you know that guy has a high potential for getting to a top position on you anyway, you know, it makes it hard to want to try to shoot on somebody when you know that that's a threat. And you start thinking, well, maybe I'm not going to get a lot of bombs on this guy. Maybe this guy's just going to submit me. And it just controls another pathway by being dangerous in that area. So whether you're a striker or a wrestler, you know, nobody's immune from getting taken down. But I think the best defense is to make them afraid to take you down, because either your striking is so threatening like a Francis Ngannou, or because your bottom game is so dangerous that they're like who wants to take down DeLindsay after watching that Jack Hermanson fight? Not me. I think the other thing I want to talk about was guillotines. You know, people keep saying, well, Dustin Poirier almost got him in a guillotine. No, I didn't. You know, Khabib's been in guillotines almost every one of his fights. When your head is down by the hip a lot and you do a lot of wrestling heavy game where you lead with your head, that's what's going to happen. Couple things that were preventative measures. By keeping your head under the chin, that's a nice preventative measure. But, you know, he's also really high acuity for escaping that position because people throw it on him so much. So his defense is better than almost anybody's offense, because I don't care how often you throw a guillotine, you're probably not going to have as much exposure to that as him, who is defending that nonstop. And guillotines are already kind of becoming very difficult to finish in MMA. People are really good at defending them. They encounter them so much. And particularly Khabib, who probably, I mean, every one of his fights he encountered it. And probably when he rolls, he encounters it all the time. So his defense against the guillotine is really high. You know, he's going to get his hips high and away. He's going to sit here, and he's going to create just enough of a space where you're not going to be able to finish this. And all that's going to happen is you're going to burn out your arms and you're going to give up position. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you are going to play this type of a game, you need to get good at guillotine defense, because you're going to encounter this a lot. I know for me, this is something that I've gotten caught a lot in my jiu-jitsu career, because I tend to lead with my head a little bit, whether I'm doing wrestling or guard passing, you know. So good time to use preventative measures and get good at the defense for it. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of Khabib Nurmagomedov. I want to thank you guys who went on and voted for him and wrote him in so that we could do this. And always thank you for your support, guys.